Is there a strategy that'll help you grow your company faster? CEO Sales Strategies is an investigative business podcast for entrepreneurial people who never stop asking questions. Highly acclaimed sales revenue growth expert Doug C. Brown interviews CEOs, business owners, and professionals who serve them to uncover and share actionable tips and methods behind their bulletproof sales strategies. Topics covered on the show include their failures, struggles, secrets, and processes that help them succeed in selling millions to billions of dollars of their products and services, all with the sole aim of helping you grow your business. If you are eager to know the most effective sales secrets from the A players of the game, then the CEO Sales Strategies podcast is certainly the place to be.
Hey everyone, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies podcast. I have an amazing guest. His name is Mr. Scott Sambucci. He owns a company called SalesQualia, and you can find them at salesqualia.com. Scott and I are going to talk about how to build a repeatable, scalable process in business. Scott is an expert in this area, and a lot of people I have found through my career, they kind of confuse growth with scalability. And we're going to talk in depth about what the difference is between those two. And we're going to talk about how do you scale? How do you scale the right way, I should say? Because the reality is a lot of companies try to scale, but they're really throwing what is called a growth process to it. They get up to a certain place, they get there and they go, okay, we're here. Now we need to go to the next level. They get stuck. And part of that reason is they haven't built in a repeatable, scalable, predictable, measurable process into that, and they're trying to scale sometimes even on talent alone, and they just get stuck, and that's it. So we're going to talk about the right way and the wrong way to do it. As I said, Scott's an expert in this. You'll really love what he has to say. So without further ado, let's go speak to Scott Sambucci. Hey Scott, welcome to the CEO Sales Strategies podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Dude, thanks for having me. I'm pretty excited about this.
Yeah, me too. Me too. We've known each other for a while. We've had good conversations. You're a super intelligent guy, and I think people are going to really get a lot out of this. And we're going to talk today about how to do a repeatable, scalable sales process.
That's what I do. So, good topic.
So, a lot of people talk to me about, well, I want a scalable, process, right? I want a scalable sales process. But they kind of throw that term around. They don't even really understand, I think, what it really means. So I thought we'd bring an expert on to actually, give a qualification of what does a scalable sales process really mean?
It's a really good question. Surprisingly, not a lot of people ask themselves, what does it mean? It's sort of like a vision that they have in their mind that we've got lots of salespeople and lots of customers all over the world. And it's just like, it's more like a feeling that they're trying to aspire to, as opposed to like a practical business definition of like, what does it mean? What does it mean to scale? So I think at a fundamental level, when I think about scale, it's almost like cloning. So if I'm doing something and I have a certain way of doing something, whether it's like, how do I go get leads, or how do I do my product demos, or how do I do customer success on the back end? And after I get a customer, like if I, Scott, can do it really well, and then I can teach someone else to do it in a relatively short period of time, and that person can do it just as well as me, if not better, then by definition, what I've done is started to scale that process within my business. Because now, instead of just me doing it with the opportunity cost of, if I'm doing customer success and I'm not doing the prospecting, well, it's great for customers because they're getting what they need and I'm doing the customer success, but it's bad for the business because I'm not prospecting, and vice versa. And so by definition, when we want to start thinking about scales from like the most sort of like first order definition of it, it's how do we find a person, or a system, a process, even sometimes software, or some mix of those things to do something that I myself as an entrepreneur may have had to do on my own. And if I can successfully do that repeatedly across the different processes within my business, starting with, on the sales side, obviously lead gen, marketing and lead gen, all the way through to customer success, now I have an organization where if I can teach it to one person and they can do it successfully, then I should be able to also repeat it to a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth and so on. And so by definition, that's where you start to get scale. I must think of, there's this, I used to read Calvin and Hobbes as a comic strip, and you might remember this, you're smiling. And there was a whole series of comic strips where he was repeating, like he had built like a cloning device of himself. And at one point there's like 20 Calvins in the bedroom, and he's like, what am I going to, and like, that's the problem now that we have to solve in the Calvin and Hobbes comic. But for us, that's actually what we want, because as owners of the company, we have a specific vision of how we want everything to be. Like, not just the vision of where we want to take the company, but like I have a very specific way of what I want lead gen to look like, and what I want my demos to do, and how I want my customers to get results. And it's virtually impossible for us to get that vision out of our head into somebody else's head. So what we're really trying to do as closely as possible is clone ourselves and clone the way that we do things, so that other people can replicate it as well as we can. And hopefully, if we're good at hiring people, then those people are actually better and smarter than us, and they can improve upon the baseline system that we started to build.
So many people, when I talk to them about scaling, they're thinking growth. And what I'm hearing you say is think cloning first.
Yeah. I mean, the growth, it's funny, like revenue is actually, if you think about like how long, if you're selling to the enterprise, right, which you've done and I've done for decades, right? If you're selling at the $100,000 a year product, software, right, you might have to take 3, 6, 12 months to sell that deal. And then you get the revenue. And then hopefully the client implements the way you want. Hopefully they get the success, and then hopefully they renew and upsell down the road. But we had to do all of the work. We had to have a lot of small successes before we even got to that $100,000 contract. So the revenue that we got for that contract is like a lagging indicator of our selling process being successful. And so if we take that individual contract and think of it as a company's revenue growth, so you're going from 1 million to 3 million, 3 million to 10 million, 10 million to 30 million, 30 million to 100, getting to those revenue numbers are actually the lagging indicator that you've built the appropriate systems in a way that enabled your company to get and realize that growth goal.
So a really interesting way to look at this, because so many people look at it opposite, and it's like, I'll just throw resources at this thing, and then we'll just throw it, and we'll just push all this process. And so what I'm hearing is get really clear about what you're cloning, and that's going to give you the sanity in the process of being able to scale that process. Because so is there a difference between cloning and repeatability?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just using the cloning as like a easy way for people to imagine, what we're talking about here. But it's repeatability before scalability. So I have a good friend, Amy Bolas, who does a lot of recruiting for SaaS startups. And one of the things that she talks about when she's working with a startup or a founder that says, hey, I need to hire a VP of sales because I want to scale my sales, right? I want to go from founder-led selling, or maybe even have a small sales team that the founder themselves are managing. But now it's time. I got to get a VP of sales to come in here and really take over so we can scale, And so she's like, that's great. Show me your sales process. And the founder's like, oh, well, we hired like these 3 AEs and they're just like going out and getting business for us. And she's like, okay, but like, show me your process. Like, how do they get leads? And she's like, the answer could be like, well, this person has a great network, and that person's good at conferences, and this person does some stuff on LinkedIn. I actually don't really know. They just fill the funnel and they close these deals and we grow revenue. And she's like, okay, so what you're telling me is you don't actually have a sales process. You've hired some people that are good at selling. They figured it out on their own. So in a way, you've got like 3 individuals selling your stuff, but you don't have any repeatable process. So it doesn't make sense to hire a VP of sales or any salesperson, even if you're trying to get to the first salesperson, until you have something that you have proven and documented to know like this is repeatable. What she likes to say is you can't scale what you don't have. So people say, oh, I want to scale my sales process. Great. First, you have to build the sales process. So to your point, Doug, it's like, well, it's time for me to scale. I'm doing 3 million in revenue. In the next 18 months, I want to get to 10 million, or I'm doing 10 million and I want to triple sales in the next 3 years to get to 30 million. So I'm going to go hire a bunch of salespeople. So they're going to help me grow. It's like, great. But what are you like, how are you going to teach them? What are you going to teach them on how your company gets leads and how your company qualifies leads and how your company does demos and discovery and overcomes objections and handles proposals and handles pricing and handles implementation. Because if it's not documented and there's no process, then you're going to hire a bunch of people, and it doesn't matter if they're the best salespeople in the world. They're going to come in and go like, "What do I do?" And you say, "I don't know, like figure it out."
Right.
And salespeople don't get hired to come in and figure stuff out. They get hired to come in and sell stuff.
Right. So they'll either flush out A, B, stay there and make up process on their own.
Yeah.
And
which might work for them individually, but not for the company as a whole.
Right. Because now we're not going to be able to make that repeated. And so, I mean, you might have 10 different people with 10 different playbooks at that point.
Potentially. Yeah.
So
which might be okay in the short run. You're like, okay, cool. If I'm doing $1 million and I go like spend a bunch of money and somehow get 10 salespeople and they each individually sell $1 million worth, you could say on the surface, like, oh, look, we scaled to 10 million in revenue. But if I look behind the curtain and say, okay, well, this rep is getting all the leads from network, and that rep's getting all the leads from LinkedIn, and that rep is getting all the leads from marketing, or whatever that is. If that person leaves, if you can't take that person out and put another one back in interchangeably, plug and play, in a theoretical sense, right? There's always going to be some training costs. To say like, hey, this is how we get leads. It doesn't matter if it's Bob or Joe or Susan or Mary, whoever I put in that territory should be able to follow this system and get roughly the same results. The territory has the quota, not the rep, in a sense, right?
So this is an interesting concept, because most people don't think so. What I heard you say is that company grew, they had growth to 10 million, but they didn't have repeatability. And so scalability equals cloning plus repeatability. So we can we can clone people, but we got to get that process to work in the cloning. So cloning plus repeatability equals scalability.
But I mean, there's the human side. I mean, again, like the cloning is, I think it's like a good concept to think about. I mean, obviously for the salespeople, they all have their own styles and personality, and you want that, right? You want a diverse team that does things different ways. Diversity in terms of how they're handling sales situations, as well as their selling style, as well as just their skin color and their backgrounds. I mean, you want that diversity. You don't want exact clones of yourself. But the concept should be, it doesn't matter what kind of person I put into a territory, say like you're going to handle the Northeast. The way that person should be generating leads, and the way that person is handling objections and talking about the company and doing our pricing and our proposals. We shouldn't have the New York person doing pricing and proposals one way and the person on the West Coast doing something totally different. If the New York person is like, oh, I price all my deals at 50K because I know I can get the deals closed at 50K, even though, we're not getting any margin. That's how I make my number. Like, that's my selling style. And the person on the West Coast is like, no, like I don't ever give discounts. I lose more deals, but I get higher revenue per deal. Now it's like, okay, well, is that okay for the business in the long run? Or should there be like standardized pricing models? Because what happens if the New York customer gets in touch with California customer, and the Californians is like, you're paying what? Like that's like, you got to have standardization. Now that rep in New York might have like the East Coast, like New York sort of style and flavor and communication, because that's like East Coast way, and the West Coast person might be more laid back, and that's like their way of doing it, because that's, the sort of MO of West Coast. Cool. But at the end of the day, they're still following the general sales process.
What if we go cross border? Like we go from United States to Europe?
That's a big challenge, because we work with quite a few companies that, because we work with tech startups, many of our clients are often companies that started in places like, we have clients in Norway, France, not Greenland, I was thinking New Zealand, Australia. And many of them have built, and established their companies at their home country, but they want to get to the US because that's where the huge market is, right? And so some of them do struggle, because the way that you might sell in Germany or Norway, just in terms of communication style, but also some restrictions they have around things like outbound. Like there's GDPR in Europe that doesn't exist the same way in the US. And so sometimes there's the struggle, and vice versa, right? If you're a US company, you're like, hey, now we're going to start selling in Europe or UK or in Norway, you realize there's some cultural differences, or just like compliance rules and regulations that are different. And there's some adjustments you need to make. But again, even there, you got to make sure that there's consistency, so that you might have a German salesperson for 2 or 3 years. If that person moves on, you got to be able to find someone else to take over that territory and not hope that that person can figure out how to sell in Germany the way the other person did, because that's too expensive for you as an executive to say, like, I'm going to hire somebody and hope they figure it out. Instead, it's like, no, we're just screening for the right candidate. That, and by the way, once we have the process documented, that actually also informs us what kinds of people we should be screening for.
That makes
So
sense.
that increases the success criteria. So we talk about this a lot with our, like when we work with founders, for example, and they say, look, we want to start scaling sales. So we're going to start doing outbound. Like all of our sales so far have been my network. I've been using investors, introductions, because I'm an expert in my area. I get up on stage at conferences and people kind of like gravitate towards me. That's how we've been getting sales. And that's okay. It's gotten us to like $1 million in revenue. Now we want to scale sales and we're going to start doing outbound. We've never done outbound before. So I'm going to go hire 3 SDRs to do outbound. And I'm like, okay, great. It's glad that you want to scale, but what kind of outbound are you doing? Like, well, what do you mean? Well, there's different kinds of outbound, right? There could be account-based selling, which is saying, okay, you're only going to focus on these 100 accounts. You're going to go super deep. You're going to research the top executives. You're really going to research and craft and really find ways to get in touch with those. And then there's outbound where it's just sort of like research 1,000, put them in an email system, batch and blast. There's outbound, which is very email driven. And there's outbound that might be for your industry, might need to be phone driven, because of the industry you're selling to. Like if you're selling to, say, commercial real estate construction, right? And you're like, hey, we're going to do outbound. Well, guess what? You're probably going to need somebody who does a lot of phone, because those people are out on projects dealing with big multi-$100 million projects or more. So they're on their phone, they're away from their desk. They're not in front of email. They're not in front of LinkedIn. So if you're like, hey, we're going to go do outbound, and then you go hire somebody who's really good doing outbound, but the outbound they've done in their past job is on email and LinkedIn. And you're like, hey, you need to hit the phone. And they're like, oh, I'm actually not good on the phone, or they don't like using the phone, or they're a Gen Z who doesn't even know how to use the phone, right? Now you've got a problem, because you might have hired a great outbound person, but it's the wrong skill set for the outbound that you need to do.
Right.
So that's where I would tell a founder, okay, cool. Before you go hire a couple of SDRs, let's figure out what your outbound process needs to look like. Let's get some documentation. Let's get some system in place. Let's figure out what that playbook looks like, so that when you go to recruit those SDRs, you can look for the skill sets that match to the activities that need to happen in order for your outbound to work correctly.
Speaking with Mr. Scott Sambucci, he owns a company called SalesQualia. They're at salesqualia.com. That's SalesQualia.com. And we're talking about scaling and repeatable, scalable processes. What I'm hearing loud and clear is not only we have to have repeatable processes in cloning, if you will, but we have to have some predictability in the actual playbooks and the process we're going to use, or scaling will become unwieldy, if you will. Is that a great way of saying it?
Yeah, I mean, part of that process that you're building is knowing what the metrics are around that process, right? So let's use the outbound example, and let's just imagine that, okay, now as a founder, before I went and hired some SDRs, I've figured out that for my industry and my business and the people I'm selling to, we need to do some targeted outbound strategy. So what that means is it's a combination of using email plus LinkedIn plus phone. I'm going to use those 3 channels to do my outreach, to contact the executives that we need to get on the phone to start the sales process. Cool. That's like my process. Now we need to know, what are the metrics that constitute success? So for example, if we're doing email, what are the open rates we should be shooting for? What are the benchmarks for reply rates or engagement rates? How many meetings should we expect to book per 100 leads that are in our outreach? Those become the benchmarks by which, okay, in my business, as long as I get 40% open rate, 10% reply rate, and 3% of the meetings 3% of the people who contact book a meeting, that becomes the KPIs for the SDRs. And oh, by the way, it also drives their compensation structure. Can you say, these are the KPIs and this is what we pay you on? Because salespeople are very, plug and play, right? It's like, right, whatever you measure is what you get. And so understanding those metrics and understanding how those systems work It's the same with like conversion rates. Okay, now we have a qualified deal in the pipeline. We need to know what's the average time to conversion. Okay, we get a qualified deal on March 1st. Our normal conversion time is 6 months, and our average contract value is $100,000. And our conversion rates are typically 30% of deals within 6 months after getting a qualified lead. Now we have some basic pipeline metrics so that when we as founders have done this ourselves and we know what those steps are, we know how to hit those metrics. Then when we go find an AE and we bring that AE in, we go, by the way, these are the benchmarks that you're going towards. And if after 3 months or 6 months or whatever, they're not getting the deal sizes you need, they're not converting the deals in the time, it takes them 12 months to convert a 30K deal instead of 6 months to a 100K deal. And oh, by the way, their conversion rate is 10% instead of 30%. Now what you realize is like, we got to coach this person up, or we just hired the wrong person.
Right.
So the processes also give you the metrics by which to measure. So that's why these, like, if you start to understand now, like why, when we're talking about repeatability and scalability, why do we talk about process? The process tells you what is working and what's not working. Number one. Number two, by having that process in place, you now have the metrics and the measurements that you need. And number three, it also dictates for you what is the job description of the kinds of people that you need to hire. And it tells you how to compensate them based on the metrics that you're measuring. And then fourthly, it lets you know whether or not that person's successful or not. So if you don't have, like, that's why we talk about process first. You can't scale what you don't have. And that goes back to, I'm going to hire 3 SDRs to do outbound for me. I hope it works. So that's why it doesn't.
And I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. I have this debate many times with business owners, right? They're like, hey, I want to throw a sales team at this. And my question is, does that solve your problem? Or does that create a new problem?
Yeah.
Right. But so many of them, Scott, are in a big rush. They're in such a rush. And what I'm hearing from you is this requires patience to scale.
Yeah, look, I know, man, like we work with startup founders, they have runways to deal with. They only have a certain amount of funding. They have pressure from their board.
Yeah.
Even if they're happy doing the selling, there's opportunity cost of their time. Because if I'm out there selling, I'm not working on product or engineering or hiring or capital raising or other things. So I get it. You're like, I just got to get that. Like, I'm spending 25 hours a week just doing sales. So that only leaves me 50 hours a week. If I work a 75-hour week to do everything else I need to be doing as a CEO. Right. Absolutely. So I get it. You're like, you hear this all, I just got to get sales off my plate. I got to get it off my plate. If I could just get it off my plate, everything would be okay. But you just find a salesperson to take this over for me. And that, yeah, I get it. Like, you want that. And frankly, the business needs that. But it also requires you to be a little bit patient, because even if, and I'd say this to founders all the time, when they say, I just want to get this off my plate, I find somebody to take this over. I'm like, listen, if I find the best salesperson in the world, I know this guy named Doug Brown. He's awesome. He's one of the best salespeople I've ever met. And I'm going to introduce him to you, and he's going to come in and sell your stuff. The chances of Doug being successful are actually really small, because you're going to tell him, Doug, go sell stuff. And Doug's going to say, great. How do you get leads? Oh, it's easy. I just text my friends from business school. Okay. Like, okay, well, I can't do that. Right. Or, yeah, I just get up on stage on conferences, and then after the conference, people come up and talk to me, and then we turn that into a conversation, and then I move into the sales up, and then we close them 6 months later. I'm like, well, I can't do that either, because I'm not you.
Right.
So, well, how do you close deals? Well, I mean, a lot of times I just give them like a really good discount, because they're like friends of mine, and I just want to get some logos, and I know we're probably selling those deals at a loss, but that's okay, because it's like growth at all costs, and I don't care. And you're like, well, I can't do that either. So now, Doug, you're like all excited about this opportunity because you're seeing the company's growing, and you're like, I'm going to take over sales. When you realize there's no process for me to follow. Now Doug, have to figure out what the sales process is that's not the founder, which could take you 6 months of experimentation, 8 months, 9 months, 12 months. Now, meanwhile, the CEO is like, what the hell? I hired this guy, Doug. Scott said he's like the best salesperson in the world. He hasn't closed the deal.
Right. And
Doug's sitting there going, well, Scott introduced me to this high, growth startup. There's no sales process. I didn't even have any leads. And by the way, like half of my compensation is based on commission. So now I've gone 12 months without closing a deal because there was no process. I had to figure this out. And now I'm unhappy. So what am I going to do? I'm going to like bolt to the next opportunity. So everybody loses.
That is so common of a scenario that you just painted. I want to hit this thing. You hit something, I think, that a lot of people who are owners, I hope your ears perked up if you're listening to this. So many founders or so many people are starting that process, or even in the midstream of that process. I see this happening with companies that are even doing 20, 30 million, trying to get up to the next level. They're going at it from a growth at all cost from the executive side. But then when their salespeople are selling at growth at all costs, they're at their salespeople saying, hey, you can't do this. So where's the balancing line for most of these companies, Scott? In other words, what I'm really trying to help out people is, should we be selling at growth at all costs at that point? Or should we just be stepping back like we're talking about, saying, okay, how do we create a cloning, repeatable, scalable, predictable process, and then go from that point forward? So where's the strategy for growing, I guess, at all costs? And where's the kind of the fine line between that and we need to really create the scalable process?
I mean, short answer is, of course, it depends. I mean, if you're, an early stage, growth stage startup that's going to be venture funded, and that funding is really focused on high, top line revenue growth, then we really just growth at all costs is literally true. You're like, it doesn't matter what the cost of the sale is, as long as we can get to 10 million this year and 30 million in 2 years, then we can get to the next round of funding so that later on we can worry about profitability. That's a common sort of path for a lot of startups. I mean, there's even companies that go public that are still operating at a loss 3 or 4 years later, because that was just like the trajectory, grow at all costs. That's what got them to that place. Now, obviously, in today's environment, there's a lot of pressure, not just on the public companies that are experiencing lower or no profitability, but even startups are getting much lower valuations because of the lack of even a path to profitability, right? So there's really been this change in attitude, even within the venture community, around like, who am I going to fund? I get it that this company is going to be losing money for a little bit, but I also need to see a path where they could operate profitably in the next couple of years in case things continue to stay bad. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, in certain environments, yes, growth at all costs is okay. And it's this sort of like old axiom of like, 3 yards in a cloud of dust. Like, I don't care how I make any progress. I'm just going to make progress and then I'll figure it out later. But for most companies, the other 99% of the companies in the world that aren't venture funded, that aren't, encouraged to be growth at all costs because they're like hoping to be the $10 billion unicorn, you've got to think more concretely about this, because while in the short run, you're like, I want to get growth and revenue, you have to remember, what is that costing you? Not just the revenue cost or the profitability cost, but the opportunity cost of your time and of your efforts. So we're working with a client right now, company's doing over $10 million a year in revenue. And the founder is doing all of the sales. Every sales lead gets passed to him and he converts the deals, and he converts them at like 80%, which has been great to get $10 million in revenue. But the problem is now he can't grow anymore. He's completely tapped out. The business is tapped out. So now he actually has to go back a couple of steps. And we're working with a sales team to figure out, like, what does an outbound motion look like for you? How are you going to get leads? And then how are you going to train your salespeople to convert their leads? Maybe not at the same rate that you can close it, because you're the founder and nobody else is going to ever be able to convert deals at the rate that you can. But it needs to be more predictable, and it needs to be more repeatable, because if you don't have those two things, you're not going to be able to be scalable. And that's where now he's realizing, okay, the growth to get to 10 million was a great number to hit, 8 figures in revenue, but the cost has been, now I have to take a couple of steps back, and those steps back might take him 12 or 18 months to build the infrastructure, the process, get the right people in the right seats so that he can go back into high growth mode that he wants to get into.
And may it even be a little drop in revenue while they're doing that?
Could be, right? I mean, think about just the training costs. Like, if I'm hiring, like we're hiring on our team for salespeople right now, and even though I've got a bunch of clarity on exactly the kind of person that we want. I think we've got like a really great candidate right now that we want to make a bet on. I know I'm still going to have to spend time with that person. I'm going to have to let that person do some of the calls. I'm going to have to let that person fail. And that time and the loss, there's going to be some deal. And I know from training salespeople, I'm like, I'm going to let Jeff run this call, and I got to let him make his mistakes. And sometimes after he makes the mistakes, I afterwards can jump in and recover the deal and get it closed anyway. Right. But sometimes like you lose it and you lose it. And that's just the way it is. And if you're even at like a 5 million, 10 million, $15 million company, like every deal matters. You feel that pain, not just in the revenue, but now it's the opportunity cost of your time training someone. And it could take weeks or months to get them up and running. And what if that person ends up not working out because you hired the wrong person? Or what if something happens to that person? They get sick, their spouse changes jobs and they have to move, to Chicago. And all of a sudden that rep that you thought was going to be working with you every day in the office is now needs to move, and they're going to work remote. And now that slows things down even more. So it's like, it's painful. A lot of times you do have to be willing to take those steps back, which means having good planning and good structure and knowing that, okay, we need to forecast in some respects a loss in revenue in the short run, and think of that more as an investment in the future of the company. Because if I don't take maybe a short-term loss in revenue, I'm never going to get from 10 to 30 in revenue that I want to get to.
I have two last questions for you. I think this is probably on some people's minds who are listening to this.
Okay.
Should they even scale? Should they grow? Do you ever get that, question posed? Like, I know I do. So that's why I was asking the question.
It's funny because a couple of weeks ago, I went down to Las Vegas just for the weekend and spend some time with a friend of mine. Actually, I went down for the CES conference and then stayed for the weekend. Great friend from high school. I've known him for 35 years. And he was asking me about my business, and we were just over lunch. And he said, like, what's the hardest thing about running your business? And I said, the hardest thing is figuring out like how much you want to grow in some ways. Mm-hmm. Because like right now, there are things we could be doing to grow sales. Like there's things we're not doing on purpose, because if we ramp up those things, we're going to get a lot more customers, which on the surface sounds great. But on the back end with delivery on the promises that we're making, I also got to figure that problem out. Because we're bringing people into our coaching program. I got to figure out, do I have the right coaches to support them? Do we have enough calls on the calendar? Do we have enough space in the calendar? How about our technology stack? When people want to go to our library and get help and self-serve, does that work well enough that they can actually self-serve themselves when they need it on a Friday night, when the one time they're working on the presentation for Monday, right? Do we have all of those things? And if we don't have all those things, and I go bring in a bunch of customers, they're just going to churn. And worse, it damages our brand. Yep. And so the way I described it to him is like, look, let's say you're $1 million business and you're operating at a 30% margin. You're earning a profit of $300,000 a year, right? Now, on the other hand, what if you ran a $3 million company on a 10% profit margin? You are earning $300,000 a year. Now you can go the other way. And I said this, I'm like, I could have no business at all other than Scott Consultant. Right. And I could probably work like 30 hours a week or 20 hours a week or 40 weeks a year. And I could probably make easily like $300K a year, $400K a year. I'll have a little expenses with travel and some other stuff. But guess what? My profit is $300,000. So some of it is just like, how much aggravation and work are you willing to put in? And is there a payoff on the back end? Because going from $1 million to 3 sounds great. I got a $3 million business, or I got a $3 million business. I want to be a $10 million business. That looks great. I know plenty of $10 million businesses that are running at 1% and 2% margins. And with the downturn, like digital agencies, for example, you could have a $10 million business doing 6 and 7 figure projects, and you got a 60-person staff that you got to feed. If all of a sudden, if you're on 2-3% margin, even 5% margin, and that one big deal doesn't happen this quarter, now you got you got people on the beach like, oh, I'm not working. I got no projects. Mm-hmm. And worse, you pay them and you didn't get the revenue. So now you're like double loss. You not only didn't get the revenue, but you got money going out. So it's like, okay, do I really want that kind of business? Can I set up my business in a way that can I still make 30% margin at a $10 million business? So I'm making 33 million a year instead of 300,000. And that goes back to having processes in place. That's the idea of scale. So the growth at all costs could lead to that situation and aggravation. It's already hard enough to run a business. I already lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, worrying about stuff at 2 a.m. Imagine if I would try to like 10x my business to be 10 million or 30 million or 100 million, wherever you are on that journey. Now you're going to be awake, not just at 2 o'clock, but at 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock.
Right. You're going to have health issues on top of this.
Yeah. And you got to decide. Sometimes it's better not to scale. It's like, what kind of life do you want to have? How much balance do you want to have? That's the other piece, right? I got an 11-year-old son. I coach his club soccer team. I don't work weekends. You know, my wife has her stuff that she's doing. I want to support her. She's a full-time PhD at UC Davis. You know, like this week, great example. So like, look, I got to be on campus 3 days this week. We got some people coming in from Poland who are here researching. I got to meet with them. I got to work with them. Got these big meetings going on. Like, I can't walk the dog in the morning. She usually does dog walks in the morning. I take my son to school. In the afternoons, we swap off. There's 3 mornings in a row. She's like, I just can't do it. Can you do it? I'm like, yeah, okay, fine. But that's because I chose to have that space in my calendar. If I go to try to like grow really quickly to 3x or 10x the business, and I can say, no, I can't, sorry. Now, am I really being a good partner there? Mm-hmm. What's more important, the business or my business or her career? Now that's where choices need to be made. And that's where people can end up really unhappy. So I've set, for me, I know where I want to be. I know what time is I'm not spending on the business because I want to be able to have that space to do something simple like that, or be able to take a week off like we're doing next week and go skiing for 4 days in Mammoth and not have to worry about stuff. So, you know, the short answer is it depends, but you don't have to grow your business.
That was question number one. The reason I asked that, I mean, you and I deal with a lot of companies, and I remember there was one that was doing 200 million a year, and the man was the most unhappy soul, probably on one of the top 5 unhappy souls on the planet. They decided to cut the business back. They're doing 60 million today. He's happy as can be.
Yep.
And he doesn't miss the 200 million at all. And so my second question is, when people are designing this or thinking about this or thinking through it, I think clarity is really important on the first step of this thing. So do you suggest somebody gets clarity on how they want their life to be and then build their business around it, or build the business first and then get clarity on their life?
I mean, that's a big question. I mean, for me, the reason that I'm doing this business is because of my family. So I was a head of sales at a company called Blend, which is now, they IPO'd in July of 2021. So back in 2013, 14, 15, I was the first head of sales, employee number 13 at this company. Great time to be there. So much fun growing the company. Went through the A round, the B round, and we were closing a C round of funding in those 2.5 years that I was there. But I was also traveling all the time. I was in Dallas and DC and Des Moines doing meetings and implementations. There was one time I was gone 8 out of 9 weeks. I was left the house Monday morning, caught a 5 a.m. flight left at 5 a.m. to get to Dallas, got home on a Thursday night, 4 days, 8 weeks out of 9. At the same time, my wife is still finishing her PhD and her son was 2 years old at the time, 3 years old. Like, at some point, right, this is not going to work. And there were some things that happened for us. It wasn't in our relationship, but my son actually got really sick one day, and I was traveling, and my wife texted me, he's really sick. It was right after we took him to daycare for the first time. So kids always get sick the first time they go to daycare. So she's texting me, he's like, Benjamin can't breathe. I got to take him to the ER. And I'm standing outside of a BW3s about to go to dinner with my team. And I'm like stuck in Dallas because it was like 6:30 at night. There's no flights. It's like, because you're going from east to west, there are no more flights. The next flight's the next morning. I'm like calling American, United, and they're like, sorry, no flights. So now I'm stuck. And I'm thinking to myself, like, is this what I want? Right? My wife to be up all night in the ER when she's supposed to be working on her dissertation. I'm not even there to help her, let alone be there with my son when he's sick. That was actually the break point for me to decide, okay, I need to unwind this position at Blend, which took me almost a year to get there. I left literally millions of dollars on the table with options to go and do this because I wanted to be home. And so for me, as I think about as I'm growing my business, I'm also balancing like how much can I push on the business, but also make sure I can take and do club soccer with my son. I can take the dog for a walk if I want to. I can go to Mammoth for 4 days and go skiing. If my wife wants to go see her family, which she did last week for 4 days, to hang out with her mom and her dad, cool, no problem. I can do school drop off and dog walks and everything else. Totally cool, because I got those times blocked off. So it's for me, it was family first. And anytime I find myself like trying to push hard at work, and I'm starting to creep into the morning time when I should be making pancakes and taking my son to school, or I find myself it's 9 o'clock at night and I should be in bed because I get up at 4 a.m. and instead I'm in the office working. I'm like, wait a second, so this is not what I signed up for, right? This is not what I committed to. So there is that balance. And now there might be certain parts of your weeks or months where you're like, hey, we're going to make a push on this thing. We got this opportunity. Like we just established this partnership with a big company. We just launched a new product. We got 3 big conferences that we know we can get some good leads at. That's where you go, okay, for this next 6-8 weeks, I'm going to do a hard push, but also promise myself and even schedule the time in after that push, I'm going to take the vacation off. I'm not going to work nights and weekends for the next 4 weeks. So sometimes it's like balance in between.
Yeah.
And just make sure you're communicating with your partner, your spouse, your family. Say, hey, I'm just letting you know, starting, March 1st with this first conference, got to do some traveling. We're doing the product launch. I'm hiring some new people. Good news is on May 1, we're taking a week off and we're going to go head out to the beach for a week, or, you want to go see your family. Cool. I'm going to take care of things at home. So it's all related to me. So to me, it's got to take care of your life first. Otherwise, you're going to be the $200 million revenue guy. It's completely freaking miserable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was wondering what your advice was on that, because I give people that same advice. Go for your life first. And I think you said it perfectly. You asked the question, is this what I want? Because I have friends who have become, billionaires at one point in their life, and then they lost control of their business. They lost their marriage. They lost their children. They lost their home. Yeah. And when I talk to them, they'll still say to today, it wasn't worth it. Right. Like I heard Dave Thomas from Wendy's once do an interview, and he said building Wendy's was the worst thing he ever did. Wow. And they said, why, Dave? And he said, because now I'm later in my years. I had no family life. I had no he just rattled it off. And he's like, so now I got all the money I want, but I don't have what I want, which is all that time back that I wanted to have with everything I wanted. Right. So when it comes to scaling, so many people think they need to scale up their business and grow their business to this next level and get that to the next level. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's a great thing, you know, but the question is that what they want? And I think that's an awesome question you asked here. And I would challenge everybody to ask that question who's listening to this. Scott, how do people get a hold of you if they want to know more about you or more about the company and what you do?
I think the best thing to do, if they, you mentioned the website SalesQualia, so it's SalesQualia, QUALIA.com. And actually one of the things I was going to offer, I've written a best-selling book called Stop Hustling, Start Scaling, which is a foundational book on how to think through building out that repeatable sales process. So if you go to salesqualia.com/book, so it's just company website.com/book, you can actually download a full free copy, PDF version of the book. So if you want to go to Amazon and buy one, that's cool. But, I'm not buying an island on Fiji with the royalties. I care less about that. I care a lot more about getting the message out to people. Yeah. So go to salesqualia.com/book. So you'll get the download, and then that'll also get you on our mailing list. We're doing tons of webinars, trainings. I'm pumping out content all the time. We have a podcast that you can subscribe to. So it's really kind of the window to my world, salesqualia.com/book. because now you'll get access to everything else that we're doing and pumping out there. So that's what I would suggest.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. And for those of you who do buy it on Amazon, give it a review. Come on.
Yeah. Well, in fact, in the book, whether you download the PDF or buy the copy, I encourage people in the introduction to send me an email to tell me that they have the book and that they're reading it, because I want to help you stay accountable. The book is written almost like a textbook. Every chapter is a set of activities. It's centered around a specific question you want to ask yourself about your business and your sales process. So every chapter is a question, and each chapter is designed to help you answer that question for your business. So there's even a companion website where you can download worksheets and really start building out a playbook for yourself using the book as a core. And so if you want to use the book the right way, best thing you do is let me put my coaching hat on, buy the book or download the book, send me an email and say, I'm now reading this book. And I will check in with you. Ask people that have downloaded the book. I do check in with them. How's it going? What questions do you have? I see whether or not people are downloading the worksheets. So it's a great opportunity to get some help from me through the book, and get in touch with me if you need to.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome, because you're the first person that I've ever heard say that. Because most people are like, buy my book, read my book, right? And you're like, hey, I'm gonna have an accountability process into this to make sure that you're actually consuming and getting forth and forward in what you're doing. So I appreciate you doing that for the audience. I really do.
You got it, Doug. Of course.
Well, thanks for being here, Scott, on the CEO Sales Strategies podcast. As always, I'd love to have you back another time. It's always a wonderful time to talk together.
Thanks, Doug.
Okay. Did you like the part about cloning? I love that, right? Because a lot of people don't think about scalability as cloning. Cloning meaning, hey, if I can take one thing and I can clone it into another thing and then clone it again and again, now put it into a process that's clonable. Now I've got something that I can scale, because the reality is it's repeatable, it's measurable, it's predictable. And that's the key in scaling. Because if you try it without, what's going to happen, and so many companies do this, and I know in my companies, we've done this in the past, we'll scale and we get to a place and we get stuck, right? And but what we're really doing is we're just growing. We're not really scaling because it's not predictable, right? As Scott and I talked about in that whole process. And part of the challenge this happens is because we're in such a big rush to get there, and we're not stepping back and creating process. We're not stepping back and taking the blueprint that we have, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, but we'll take the blueprint and we're not building with high quality, let's say we're building a home. We're not building with high quality structural materials, let's say. We're just saying, oh, we got to put this home up in 2 months, even when the job requires 6 or 8. And that's where we get a bit into trouble. Yeah, we grow, we get some extra money, and then what do? We try to backfill that. But then what we're doing is really we're taking a step forward and 3 steps back. And what happens is we've got to create and go through that whole process again to create the scalable process and the predictable process. I go through this with so many clients because they just don't understand the foundation of that. And so before you actually get the blueprint, great question to ask is, do I even want to do this? And as Scott said, is this what I want? So get very clear on that process in the beginning, because if it's not what you want and you're trying to do it and you do it, you might find yourself in a place that's way more stressful than you ever wanted to be. You may not even have, as Scott and I were discussing, you may not even have more money. You may have had a higher profitability at a lower revenue and had a life. When you get to a higher profitability, a higher revenue without the profitability, now what you have is you have a lot more mouths to feed and a lot more responsibility, but you're not making any more money and you may be not happier than you were before. So ask that question, should I scale? Is this what I really want? What do I really want? So start with that point of clarity and then move forward. I highly recommend that you get his book and read this book. It will give you massive clarity on where you want to go and probably answer that question for you. Is this what I really want? If you love this topic, please give it a 5-star review. Thank you for all of you who have been doing so. If you have any questions on that, you can certainly contact Scott directly. He gave you his contact information. It will be in the show notes. If you're an expert in a field or you know somebody who's an expert in a field and you're like, hey, I would like to have a subject done on this particular subject matter in this podcast, reach out to us at YouMatter, YOUMATTER, at ceosalesstrategies.com, and we will respond to you either way. We'll review all responses and respond to you. If you want to get yourself or someone you know into the top 1% of sales earners, you want to learn that process, you want to put that process in place for yourself, maybe your sales team or someone you know, reach out to me directly at doug@ceosalesstrategies.com, and I will certainly respond to you. Until next time, go out, sell something, sell a lot of it, play win-win. That means you help someone, they help you. That is the best sale in the world. And that also makes sure that your sales are profitable and that you're taking yourself into the next level day upon day upon day upon day, if that's what you want. Until next time, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast. Thanks for spending some time again with us today, and to your success.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast. What is something that you learned that you could act on today? Don't forget to schedule it now, or it may never get forward momentum. If you find our content valuable, please leave a favorable review and let us know what you liked. Please also share this with others if the content will help them. For our show notes, other episodes, and more interesting content and resources, please visit ceosalesstrategiespodcast.com. See you soon, and to your continued success.